G'day everyone, hope you're all keeping well. Back with the second part of making, long overdue second part of making our custom bases. In this video we're going to learn about how I mix up our 2 parts of resin, how I use baby powder or talcum powder inside our mould. As you can see, it's been months since I filmed that first part, and the mould is still sitting inside that Lego case, so we'll unbox that, demold it, and have a look at that mould. We'll pour in some talcum powder, brush it around with a brush, tap it out, mix up our 2 parts resin in a little disposable plastic cup, pour it in there, wait for them to dry, pop it out, and there we go, our first cast out of our custom mould. So thanks very much for your patience. Sorry to everyone who sent me messages saying when's the second part coming. It's coming now. Thanks guys. Okay, so here's our mould that we made in the earlier video. As you can see, it's on a hardboard base. It's got a Lego wall around it, and inside here are 2, I think 40mm bases. So let's go ahead and pull off all this Lego around the outside. I did put a couple of small drops of glue onto this Lego to glue it down to the hardboard, but as you can see, I've only just used a little bit and it comes off fairly easily. So there's our Lego wall removed, and I end up with the mould. All I need to do is just break the seal on this side, break the seal on this side, break the seal on this side, and break the seal on this side, and then slowly peel it off. There are my 2 bases sitting inside the mould. Sometimes you'll still get them stuck to the base here, and that's my preference, to use enough glue on the base to glue it to the board, so that by the time I demold it, my bases are still on the board, so if I need to cast another mould, I just rebuild my wall and pour more silicone in, and there we go. Given that my master base survives. So as you can see, there's a little bit of silicone has seeped underneath the base. That's not really too much of a problem. We can trim that up, and many times you can see that it just peels off because the seal is very, very thin. Anyway, so let's just pop these bases out. So I loosen the edges all the way around using my thumb underneath to lever the base up, and then get to a point where I can pull it out. You can see that something has been left inside the mold here. A little piece of slate. That'll come out fairly easily, and it'll certainly come out in the first cast that we do. The second one, again, a few little pieces of slate left behind. But there's our 2 bases that we molded, and you can see in this one here the silicone on the inside that has that has torn away from my mould, unfortunately, but I'll still get a reasonable gap in between these 2 pieces of slate. So there's my mould. I get all this flashy stuff around the edge, and normally I'd use a pair of scissors, which I have no idea where they are at the moment. Hang on, I'll grab some. Right, so normally I take a pair of scissors, and on the bottom of the base you can see this little lip here. Normally I just trim that off around the base, around the sides, on the top, just so that the mould, when it sits on the ground, sits flat. It doesn't have those little lips sort of that might sort of put it off of being flat on the base. So I just take the scissors and cut a small bevel on the edge. It just helps clean the mould up and makes it look a little bit neater. For anyone who has Hurst Arts moulds, you'll notice that they also come from Bruce with this bevel on the edge, and that's the reason why, so that when the mould sits on the ground on your table, it's lying flat. There's no extra silicone that's come up the side of the mould box or something like that to put the mould off of sitting flat on the table. So we'll just finish cleaning this up. There we go. Take off all this little bit of silicone that's seeped inside the Lego. That all just peels off, and there we go. We have a relatively neat looking silicone mold. Okay, so now what I do before I go ahead and I start mixing up my silicones with a little bit of black dye in the cups, etc., I just prep my mold. So I'm going to clear out as much of that stuff that was left by my master. And then I've got some talc in a cup and a paintbrush, and I'm just going to dip it into that talc and then brush a layer into my mold. There we go. So as you can see, I've got quite a lot of talcum powder in there at the moment, and then I'm just going to tap it out quite sharply. And once I tap it out, I end up with a very fine residue inside my mold. Now I normally take a disposable cup and a set of scales and my 2-part resin. This is a very fast cure polyurethane resin. This is a brand called EasyCast from Barnes. Now unfortunately, during the moving and storing and packing of everything, my scales broke. So unfortunately I can't use those. Normally though, I'd measure out equal parts of these in the same cup and mix them together and then pour them into this mold. But I'm going to have to eyeball it for this cast, I suppose, until I get some new scales. Okay, so normally I do my clear part first. I guess it really doesn't matter which order you do it in. And I'm just going to eyeball this. So there's my clear part. Now before I add the second part, I add a couple of drops of a black ink, a black dye. This is a resin casting dye. And this is just going to help this resin change colour from white to black, or to grey, I suppose. So I've added a couple of drops to that. Now I'm going to add my second part of my now I've got to try and eyeball this so to the top of that circle. I reckon that'll do. I could have measured out 2 parts in 2 different cups and then mixed them together, but bugger it. So I've got a couple of seconds now before this starts to set up, so I've got to give it a good stir. That colouring in there makes me, or helps me identify when I've got a good mix. I don't have a lot of time to stuff around with this because it's a very fast cure, and I can already feel the cup going warm as the resin starts to set up. Normally I'd have a plastic sheet down on top of my table as well, because it's a lot easier to clean up spills from. So I'm going to pour a little bit in here, pour the rest in here. I haven't got enough silicone. I'm going to be short a little bit, just a little bit, but for the purposes of this, sorry, silicone, I don't have enough resin, sorry. For the purposes of this, it's good enough. So normally what I do when I cast my first set of bases out of a new mold, I mix up silicone, resin, I pour it into my mold, I make sure that I might have some excess left over which I chuck out. Once I've got 2 perfectly fine bases cast, I weigh them. Once I've weighed them, I know how much total resin I need to be able to fill up the molds. That way then I can take that total value, which in this case I'm assuming is probably going to be around 25-26 grams of resin. Then I know that I need half of each of my 2 parts of silicone. So we'll leave that there to set up. That's going to take about 15 minutes. So you'll notice as it starts setting up, it'll start to get hard, change colour. This would normally be white, instead it's grey because of the black dye that I added. Now the resin dries in a very specific way. It normally dries the thickest part of the resin first, and then the thinnest part of the resin dries slower than the thicker parts of the resin. I don't know why. That's what I've noticed in my experience, and as you can see from these bases in the interior where there's going to be more resin because the bases are deeper, they have that slate on them, is drying slower than the parts that are shallower. I don't know why. Anyway, so we'll finish letting that dry up. Just as an example of that, you can hear my bases and they're drying. And here is the cup. It's still, it hasn't changed color at all. There's a very thin layer of resin in here, so it's going to take longer to dry than these bases will. Weird, bizarre. I'll leave that there. Okay, so these bases have been setting up for a little while. As you can see, the complete surface of the base has gone grey, the cup has gone grey, and if I tap these now, they've also gone hard. So it's been about 15 minutes. I'm going to pop them out of the bases. So same way I took out the masters, I'm just going to flex the edges and pop that base out and flex this. You can see on this base here, this little dark circle is a piece of the slate that came out of the master, and pop this one and pop this one. And there we go. My two bases. All I'd do from here, if I'd filled the mold up properly, I'd still have a little lip on the bottom of this base. I'd just rub it on some sandpaper. So there we go, we've made our own mold. I've talked it, filled it full of resin, and popped out two completely identical copies of my original masters. So there we go, guys, fairly straightforward. Maybe in the next part I'll paint up these bases just so you can see them finished. But it's fairly straightforward. We've got ourselves a silicon mold now. I can use as many times as I want. Normally I talc it every time I pour a mold. If I don't talc it, especially with things that have got detail, then I'm going to get air bubbles. As soon as I started talking my molds, it reduced 99% of my air bubbles. If I have a bubble in my mold, well, talc's not going to get rid of that. You're going to end up with a bubble in your cast. So there we go, guys. Have fun. Sorry again for the massive delay, the months and months and months in between the two parts of the video, but I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was helpful, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.